A quiet house with heavy curtains drawn can feel ordinary from the outside, yet inside it can hold something that changes the air itself. In this case, it is stacks of cash so vast they seem to bend reality, money piled high enough to make even seasoned investigators pause. For a nation wrestling daily with rising food prices, rolling blackouts, and public services stretched to breaking point, the idea that as much as 250 million rand could be sitting inside a private residence lands like a physical blow. Not in a bank, not in a regulated vault, but hidden behind closed doors, tied to circles of power that shape national life. The shock is not just about the money, it is about what that money represents in a country where millions count every rand and still fall short. Tonight's story reaches far beyond currency. It is about access, privilege, and power, and it forces South Africans to confront uncomfortable questions they have faced before but never quite resolved. As investigators dig deeper, the narrative only grows more unsettling, with the most revealing details still waiting in the shadows. Pause for a moment and imagine if such a discovery were made in your own neighborhood, connected to leadership you are expected to trust. How would you react, and what would it do to your faith in the system meant to serve you? In the early hours after the discovery, nothing suggested that history was about to tilt. Neighbors spoke of a normal day unfolding as usual. There were no blaring sirens, no crowds gathering at gates, no spectacle for cameras. Only officials moved quietly, their seriousness signaling that something had already gone wrong long before the public knew. When the news finally broke and the figure emerged, it sounded unreal, almost fictional. 250 million rand is not a number that slips easily into the imagination. It is not loose change or a briefcase of notes, it is schools built, clinics staffed, housing projects funded, all compressed into paper and stacked behind locked doors. This was not an ordinary find, and everyone knew it. Cash is tangible, heavy, and intimate. It carries fingerprints, histories, and questions that refuse to stay buried. To understand the depth of the shock, one must grasp the sheer scale involved. 250 million rand in physical notes is enormous, not just in value but in volume. It requires boxes, planning, transport, and storage, all of which immediately raise red flags for investigators trained to follow the trail of financial crime. In South Africa, where cash-in-transit heists regularly dominate headlines, the private storage of such an amount triggers every alarm in the system. The question is not only where the money came from, but why it was there at all. Investigators approach cases like this by tracking patterns rather than personalities. They ask how the money moved, over what period of time, and who had access to it. In the eyes of the law, political status offers no exemption. What matters is explanation. Was the cash declared? Did it form part of a legitimate transaction? Or does it point to concealed dealings and undeclared flows of wealth? These are procedural questions, not personal attacks, yet their answers carry enormous consequences. Once politics enters the frame, however, procedure rarely moves at the same speed. Power has a way of complicating truth, bending timelines, and introducing hesitation where clarity should prevail. The weight of this story grows heavier as its proximity to influence becomes clearer. The individual linked to the property is no ordinary citizen but someone operating near the center of power, where decisions ripple outward to affect millions of lives. Investigations involving senior political figures are never isolated events. Phones ring behind closed doors. Statements are drafted and redrafted. Allies observe closely, calculating their positions. In South Africa, influence is often subtle and strategic rather than overt. Silence can be as deliberate as speech, and absence can speak louder than outrage. Legally, the situation is complex and nuanced. South African law does not automatically criminalize the possession of large sums of cash. Context is everything, including the source of the funds, whether they were disclosed properly, and the intent behind their storage. Authorities must verify that the money aligns with declared income and lawful activity, a process that takes time and demands meticulous work. In high-profile cases, time itself becomes a force, exerting pressure on institutions and testing public patience. The law is designed to move deliberately, not impulsively, but deliberation can easily be mistaken for delay when trust is already fragile. Outside government offices and legal chambers, public reaction is far less restrained. At taxi ranks, in workplaces, and around dinner tables, people do their own calculations, comparing this fortune to their monthly struggles and unpaid bills. They ask why leadership appears insulated while communities stretch every rand to survive. These conversations do not follow legal frameworks or wait for official conclusions. They are raw, emotional, and deeply personal, shaped by lived experience rather than statutes. For many, trust is no longer eroding slowly, it is fraying visibly. This story evokes memories of the past, of scandals that marked the ANC's long tenure in power. Some allegations were proven, others denied, and many left unresolved. Each new revelation builds on the last, layering perception upon perception until suspicion hardens into something difficult to reverse. History does not reset simply because time passes. The choreography of official responses has been striking. Statements often manage to say a great deal while revealing very little. Calls for patience are issued, and restraint is praised as maturity or discipline. Outrage, if it exists, is carefully muted. In politics, how one responds can matter as much as what is actually said. Restraint may appear responsible to some, but to others it feels evasive, even calculated. Behind the scenes, investigators and legal experts work through files, trace financial flows, and prepare for multiple contingencies, all while feeling the weight of public expectation pressing down. In moments like this, credibility is tested not by speeches or press conferences, but by concrete actions and visible progress. South Africans have seen cases stall before. They have watched momentum fade, files go missing, and charges quietly dropped. That collective memory makes this moment feel decisive even before any conclusion is reached. When politics intersects with criminal procedure, tension is inevitable. Party loyalty collides with constitutional duty, and law enforcement is forced to prove its independence not through promises but through outcomes. Once the public begins to believe that certain individuals are untouchable, the damage extends far beyond a single case. It reshapes citizens' trust in the state itself, undermining the legitimacy of institutions meant to serve everyone equally. Amid all of this, the human cost is often overlooked. While investigators focus on figures and documents, ordinary people carry the emotional burden. A nurse waits for equipment that never arrives. A student hopes for funding that remains just out of reach. A small business owner counts losses during yet another blackout. When vast sums are hoarded privately, people do not see only a legal question, they see opportunity lost and inequality made visible. The abstract idea of corruption becomes painfully tangible. Public confidence in law enforcement is scrutinized just as closely as political leadership. Citizens want to believe that the law applies equally, regardless of status or connections. Yet past experiences have taught many to be cautious. Every delay is analyzed, every leak fuels suspicion, and every unexplained silence deepens doubt. The way this case is handled may matter as much as its final outcome. Credibility is not something that can be declared, it must be earned through consistent, transparent action. Trust must be demonstrated, not demanded. Political interference, whether subtle or direct, further complicates the landscape. Sometimes it appears as a raised eyebrow or a quiet reminder of alliances and histories. Investigators are trained to resist such pressure, but they operate within systems shaped by careers, reputations, and hierarchies of influence. South Africans are adept at reading between the lines, especially when progress slows without explanation. Pressure shapes behavior long before any courtroom is involved, and judgment forms in living rooms, online spaces, and community gatherings. The court of public opinion responds quickly to patterns and past disappointments, creating narratives that are difficult to undo once established. Precedent looms heavily over this story. South Africa has seen shocking cases before, where evidence was mishandled, files misplaced, and accountability quietly abandoned. Each unresolved episode sets expectations for the next, creating a weary familiarity among citizens. Beyond politics, there is also an economic signal being sent. Investors watch governance closely, and stories of unexplained wealth at the top raise concerns about stability, transparency, and accountability. These perceptions influence decisions that extend far beyond national borders, affecting jobs, growth, and livelihoods. Reputation, in this sense, is not abstract, it has real economic consequences. At its core, this is a story about accountability. South Africans are not asking for perfection, but for fairness and consistency. They want to know that no one is above scrutiny and that the system functions even when doing so is uncomfortable or inconvenient. Whether this moment breaks a long-standing cycle or reinforces it remains uncertain. Justice is defined not by isolated acts, but by consistency over time. Interestingly, the figure itself, the 250 million rand, begins to fade into the background. The true shock lies in what it symbolizes: unanswered questions in a society exhausted by explanations that lead nowhere, and a widening gap between those who lead and those who struggle simply to get by. This story is far from over. Investigations require patience, and due process remains essential in any functioning democracy. South Africa's democratic health depends as much on restraint as it does on accountability. Patience, however, should not be confused with complacency, and respect for the law should never become acceptance of inequality. Citizens are seeking clarity, consistency, and visible integrity from institutions charged with protecting the public interest. What happens next will echo far beyond a single residence or political figure. It will shape conversations about justice, influence how young people view leadership, and determine whether trust in public institutions erodes further or begins, slowly, to rebuild. Moments like this do not merely generate headlines, they define eras. South Africa has stood at crossroads before, sometimes choosing courage and sometimes choosing convenience. The difference between those choices becomes clear only years later, measured in public confidence and institutional strength. This case matters even before any charges are laid because it tests whether accountability in the country is genuine or selective. For now, attention remains fixed on the process itself. Rumors, speculation, and political theater should take a backseat to actions that demonstrate transparency and resolve. Institutions that act decisively remind citizens that democracy still carries weight. Those that do not risk allowing damage to seep in slowly, deeply, and in ways that are difficult to repair.